Hi everyone, it's me again. Today we're going to continue the discussion about threat, stress, and particularly chronic threat stress and what it does to us in terms of our mind and body. But more specifically today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the mind or mental health under chronic threat stress. So I always like to start with a brief review of the threat stress response, just so that nobody's left behind, and also it kind of reinforces what we're talking about for everybody. So as we've mentioned before, the centerpiece of our threat response is our amygdala. It's housed in the, we have two of them housed in the temporal lobes of the brain, about the size of an almond. Under chronic threat stress, it actually starts to grow, and if we move ourselves more into a relaxed and safe physiology, it'll shrink a little bit. It starts a cascade of events that initially through the hormonal tract sends a signal down to the hypothalamus, which signals the pituitary, which then signals down to the rest of the body, but particularly the adrenal gland, to put out some adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline jacks up our heart rate, our respiratory rate, increases the force of contractions of the heart, so it's a more efficient pump, and it also jacks up our blood pressure. It gets us ready for fight or flight. The cortisol has a number of different functions in this mode, but what we've been talking about is it's really designed to mobilize fuel, and it can mobilize fuel from fat cells and from protein tissues as well, so that if we're starting to run out of glucose and glycogen, we have some resources to keep up the fight and flight. It has some interesting properties with the immune system and interesting properties also in mental health issues and how it affects the brain and our circulating hormones. And then less through the blood flow system and more through the tissues and the neurologic system, we have an increase in noradrenaline, an activating transmitter in the brain and the body. We have an increase in glutamate, which activates all of our kind of sensory systems, heightens them. We're more aware under the influence of glutamate, and glutamate also helps to embed pathways and memories, so that if we run into a tiger in the woods again, we kind of remember the scenario quicker and escape faster. We've talked about histamines and how they get elevated. The histamines are responsible for allergic type reactions, but we can think of them as being pro-inflammatory and pro-immunologic. So they're going to stimulate an aggressive inflammatory response and an immune response to anything attacking us. Then lastly, we've been focusing on pro-inflammatory cytokines, which is similar to histamines. They they set the table for an aggressive inflammatory response and an aggressive immunologic response. In the case of a virus or a bacteria, to kill those specifically if that's the primary attack. But even if it's a tiger or bear attack, if we've been bit, scratched, or had a chunk of tissue taken out and embedded with some bacteria, it's nice to have an aggressive inflammatory and immune response to go in and kind of clean up that area and allow us to heal. We didn't have good sterility 200,000 years ago, nor antibiotics to treat that kind of thing. So for our survival, it was very adaptive to have an aggressive inflammatory and immune response when we're under attack. And we talked about the fact that it doesn't matter so much what the vector of the attack is, whether it's a virus, a bacteria, whether we are attacked by a lion, tiger, or bear, whether or not we step on a nail or burn ourselves. And we've also talked about that toxic people sometimes attack us physically or emotionally. Sometimes we have negative thoughts that can be a form of an attack on us. We also have predictive codes running in the subconscious of the brain that can sense whether something seems dangerous or not, even prior to us being conscious of that kind of danger. And we've talked about the fact that we can suppress negative thoughts or suppress aversive emotions, and that energy can go down into the subconscious in a sort of shadow or cellar of the brain and create a certain energy that can keep stimulating our threat stress response. So regardless of whether it is a direct physical attack, more of a predictive code attack, or whether or not it's more of an emotional attack that we're acutely aware of, or even a suppressed or repressed kind of energy. All of those things keep poking at this little amygdala and creating this big cascade of events and sort of this change in the physiology of our body. So with that, let's just kind of move over to the fight or flight response. If you remember, we talked about fight or flight having all of these things going for it. So it brings us to awareness. It is we are programmed to mobilize, to either fight or flee. We become more reactive and less contemplative. Our immune system is actually jacked up. We talked about that, and the inflammatory system is jacked up, and we talked about the fact that for fight and flight we need energy because we're going to consume energy, and so our energy system is also jacked up. Now we've also talked about when we start to lose the fight, one of our feel-good neurotransmitters, dopamine, starts to drop, and our predominant neurotransmitter becomes this noradrenaline. It makes us a little bit more jittery and a little bit more vigilant and a little bit more impulsive, and we're much more likely to then turn and run for the hills than continue to fight. But when we start failing in that mode through a number of different chemical events, we actually flip from kind of this driver of the amygdala, although it doesn't really shut down. It continues to sense threat and throw out some pro-inflammatory cytokines and some glutamate and that type of thing. But when we're running out of gas, or we perceive we're going to lose the battle, or we're getting our ass kicked, we can flip into a very primitive tone, I call it, where this part of the brain is more dominant, and this is the dorsal motor nucleus that is really responsible for our freeze and faint physiology. So freeze and faint is more of a surrender mode. It's feigning death, in fact. So maybe they'll pass us over and allow us to lie still and recover. So freeze and faint is more characterized by immobility. We can appear withdrawn. Sometimes we get very stuck. We, cognitively can't make movement, let alone physically make movement. When it gets really severe, we can start to dissociate, lose the sense of ourselves, lose the sense of others and the world around us, and feel just slightly disconnected. And in those states, people will often describe feeling numb, which makes sense. In freeze, you might actually feel kind of numb. Not only do we detach from our emotional cortex and our cognitive cortex, we start detaching away from some of the other sensory and emotional cortex that's a little bit more primitive, and we feel detached or dissociated. That can actually then progress into frank collapse, a physical collapse on the ground, or even a cardiovascular collapse because our heart rate and our blood pressure and our respiratory rate all start going very low. So we've characterized that by being a physiology that's very depleted of transmitters. Dopamine goes down, noradrenaline goes down, and in both fight and flight and freeze and faint, our serotonin, our chill kind of feel content and want to connect and bond neurotransmitter is very low in both of these. So this becomes a very low energy state, not only in terms of generation of fuel, but in consumption of fuel. We're very much immobilized. And the interesting thing in this state, though, is that our inflammatory system seems to stay a little hyperactive in this state, and yet our immune system falls, and this is characterized by decreased activity in our white blood cells that go out and chew up invaders. So that gets to be a really dicey state where we don't have a lot of energy or resources to battle, and we have potentially a lower immunity, which in the acute state can set us up for a bad viral or bacterial attack, or if we have scrapes and scratches and puncture wounds and tissue missing, that can be a problem with cleaning up the dead tissue and the bugs. But in the chronic state of where this is more of a spiritual attack or an emotional attack, our immunity runs low and more risk for infections and cancers. So that becomes a very dicey physiology, and we really want to stay out of this physiology. In fact, we've talked about how if you have a high level of baseline threat stress in your life, and that can also be multifactorial in how it gets stacked up, and then you get a very virulent virus like the COVID-19 virus, that total load can kind of put your physiology over the top and throw you into this collapse mode. And that's when you end up having issues with more issues with breathing, and end up in the ICU and perhaps on a ventilator. So let's shift gears though away from the physical stuff and go back more to kind of the mental health stuff. So if we're in fight or flight physiology, we tend to be anxious, we tend to be avoidant, right? We don't really want to try to connect with people when they might be attacking us. We tend to have impaired attention and concentration, and we previously talked about in fight or flight, the prefrontal cortex, this frontal part of our brain tends to go offline, and that's where we do a lot of attending and concentrating. This part up here, more cognitive or intelligence quotient type stuff, and this part down here, more emotional bonding, connecting type stuff. So this is the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So attention and concentration goes down, but it's a mobilization thing. So activity goes up, movement goes up, right? And sometimes it's just motion and it's not even movement. When we see people with agitation who just can't sit still, they may not actually be getting anywhere, they're just moving. People become more impulsive, they become more oppositional, they can become rageful and explosive. And just putting it down here, some of this stuff, the heightened sensations that feel toxic, the shutting down of language centers, and some of the frontal cortical function, and that type of thing can be seen in syndromes like autism, and begs us to question whether autism at some point is related to a hyperactive threat stress response in developmental stages. But having said that, when you look at this, These resemble a lot of primary psychiatric kind of diagnoses. An anxiety disorder, an avoidant type of personality, attention concentration issues combined with increased activity sounds a lot like attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity disorder, impulse control disorders, oppositional disorders, explosive disorders. So you can see that the fight or flight system, if it runs chronically, is going to set us up for some of those primary psychological diagnoses that we see all the time. Well, let's go up to freeze and faint. So if you're in this sort of surrender mode, in this energy conservation mode, you're going to be more immobile and you're going to look depressed. So as all those neurotransmitters go out of you, the ones that make us stand up tall and be open or aggressive, or perhaps be a little bit more relaxed and connective, all go away, and we tend to sort of round over into sort of a submissive, defeated posture and look depressed. We lose expression in our face as well as slumping in our spine. So depression is really the flipping or sliding into this freeze and faint physiology. When you get severely depressed and you're basically mute and immobile, then even your language center is way offline. Then you can look what they call catatonic. And if you get dissociated, if the cerebral cortex is kind of offline, then you feel this dissociation, and that can go into actually being psychotic. And we kind of know that when cortical functions aren't getting their normal sensory input to them, they have a tendency to want to sort of make things up, to fill in the blanks where normal sensation isn't coming in. And when we go in freeze and faint, we lose a lot of the normal cortical inputs, at least the strength of the signaling, and so we can start to kind of make things up. And you can imagine under threat, when we start making things up, perhaps precipitated by some of these predictive codes that are biased in threat, that we may have some paranoia, or we may even have some frank hallucinations, and those hallucinations, because of the physiologic state we're in with an active amygdala, those hallucinations can be threatening. Not all hallucinations are threatening. And so that starts to look a little bit like a schizophrenia. So, and then we have these disorders here in between freeze and faint and fight and flight. And bipolar affective disorder, you could imagine perhaps it represents somebody on the threat stress spectrum that sometimes is in fight or flight and very activated and perhaps appearing manic-y, constant motion, and maybe then flipping in more to freeze and faint when stresses get more severe and suffering from depression in that state. PTSD may also be a diagnosis that flops back and forth. The physiology of freeze and faint is marked by depression, whereas the physiology of fight and flight is more that psychomotor agitation, hypervigilance, insomnia, kind of an activating mode. They're both just on the spectrum of threat and stress. And arguably similarly with panic. So as fight or flight gets jacked up, right, and everything's just racing, mind is going blank, language is offline, the heart rate's pounding, your respiratory rates increase, but you can't quite catch your breath, and then pretty soon, boom, it gets too high, and in panic we can flip into freeze and faint, where we'll have a syncopal episode, or we'll have a fainting episode, where all of a sudden we will drop our blood pressure, drop our heart rate, and collapse to the ground. So those are really the primary psychological diagnoses. And also, if we look at them up and down, we can go, well, they all have some aversive type of emotions going with them, right? You know, we're talking about fear and paranoia. We're talking about anger. We're talking about sadness. So they all have sort of these aversive sensations or feelings, emotional feelings going through our body that we really don't like. It doesn't feel good. They're bringing us to attention to say, hey, you know, something's up here. I think I'm in danger, or I am in danger, or I'm getting my ass kicked. I better pay attention. And these are kind of our body's different strategies to get out of a situation, get to safety, and security, getting out of danger. So it becomes much more obvious when it's a physical attack, kind of what our options are. When it is a spiritual attack or an emotional, social, you know, financial kind of crisis, it's not always that clear, you know, what we should be doing. We do know that under those types of attacks, you know, we tend to see more fighting and fleeing and more depression, right? So, you know, it's scary in the crisis of current times that we should anticipate increased domestic violence, increased child abuse, increased general hostility, perhaps you know, exploding into some violence in the streets. You know, we just heard that there were a lot of gunshot injuries in Chicago last night, as they are sort of starting to rise up that exponential curve of COVID-19 crisis. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that energy when we feel like we're ill-equipped, you know, sort of to flee or to fight, and we're going down the tubes? Well, one of the things that we tend to do is to try to achieve some kind of control in our life. Having a sense of control seems to calm our system, at least at a conscious cognitive level. So that tends to be our strategy. And in fact, you can sort of look at psychotherapy type strategies for treatment, and a lot of them tend to argue for reestablishing control in people's lives. And I think that that's not a bad idea, particularly in acute crisis, is to find an area where you do have some control in your life and take that on. But I will say that my sort of personal experience in my worldview is that control frequently is actually an illusion. And I think the COVID-19 crisis really exemplifies that. It really demonstrates to us as simple human beings inhabiting this earth how little we actually have control over. And in previous sessions, we've talked about the fact that we actually don't have a lot of control even over ourselves. You know, we've got all of this automatic stuff going on in our brain and our body that we don't necessarily want it to go haywire. You know, we don't want to be stressed. We don't want to have high blood pressure. We don't want to get cancer, right? So, but we really don't have a lot of control over that, and therefore it is even more illogical to think that we should be able to control other people and then control the world and then control Mother Nature. So I think we have to always concede to who we are as human beings and have some humility. And with that, we don't necessarily gravitate towards having to get control. We can use other more adaptive strategies, such as taking our emotions on and really dealing with them, recognizing them, identifying them, integrating them, letting stuff go that we shouldn't hold on to heal ourselves. But we tend to want control. So I talked about that it is more of an illusion than a reality. So what are all of the illusion of control mechanisms that we get into? So these actually start to look a lot like secondary psychological diagnoses, but they start out kind of as our personality traits. And when they get too jacked up, at some point arbitrarily somebody might say, well, you have a disorder. But that is, it's all on a continuum, and where that threshold is, where it goes from a trait to a disorder, sometimes is hard to identify. And we also know that it's going to fluctuate for all of us depending on how much threat stress we're under. So if we're under very little threat stress, we might just have a little personality trait. If we're under a lot of threat stress, it may blow up into a disorder. So let's talk about just some of the illusion of control strategies that we use. There's sort of this passive dependent personality. These are the people who try to get what they need from other people by being very passive, but unable to fend for themselves. So this could be called invalidism, but they are able to somehow get some of their needs met by the dependency that they have on other people and being able to evoke sympathy and empathy from them. But that doesn't work over the long run. You know, people burn out and it's not a successful long-term strategy. So again, a lot of things that we can do acutely to meet our needs, if we use them long-term, they don't work so well and they cause toxicity. And we were making that analogy about suppressions and repressions the other day, and even opioids. They can work for an acute fracture really well. If you use them chronically, they don't work well, we get worse. So all of these kind of will fall into that pattern. The passive aggressive person is more likely to get their needs met by manipulation and deception. You know, that works for a while until people catch on, or, you know, if it gets too severe, it's really kind of repulsive for people, so it starts to fail. That illusion of control strategy is not successful if used chronically. Egoism is another illusion of control strategy. So that's when people invest in achievement and heroic acts and in trying to have a sense of control over the world by all the boxes that they have ticked, right? Well, again, that isn't necessarily so toxic to other people, but it can certainly lead to burnout and not be successful over the long run. And the next one is the strategy of narcissism. So a narcissist is highly controlling of other people and trying to control the world around them. The problem with narcissism is as the threat stress response goes up, it gets more severe, and they will go to all means to try to stay in control. Their deal is accumulating power and strength, particularly over other people. So as it gets more toxic, as threat stress rises and this strategy gets more toxic, they start becoming demeaning. They will bully, and there will be a lot of emotional, psychological, spiritual abuse and control strategy going on, and then it can precipitate into frank physical abuse. And if you take away their control strategy from them, then they can become, you know, really explosive sometimes. So these things here, these tend to be people who are trying to control the external world, particularly other people. And when we talk about when you feel like you need control, it may actually be a boundary issue. So these people tend to have the inability to not, that's a double negative. These people have the tendency to not be able to stop themselves from invading into other people's space. In other words, they don't respect other people's boundaries very well. Okay, so now let's go down here to this next cluster of strategies. The passive sort of control person may not be trying to control another person, but they may focus a lot on themselves and what they what they do their best to control about themselves and their body, their behavior, and as well as their body. So they can have a lot of things like eating issues and caloric intake issues and purging, and then also can be a little bit more focused on things like appearance and what they can control there. So it's very much internalized. It's still you know, a problem of someplace, a hyperactive threat stress response that gets sort of internalized. They somehow don't feel safe and in control, and those are their strategies, which can be quite devastating, particularly in a severe anorexic. And then another strategy is sort of perfectionism. If you have everything in your world just perfect, your house, your car, your job, your kids, and you feel like it's perfect, and the world maybe is going to kind of see it as being perfect, and you're spending all of your energy feeling like if you just keep everything perfect, everything's going to be okay. Well, that is a great method of sort of compartmentalizing your negative thoughts and repressing some aversive emotions and keeping yourself busy with creating this perfect world around you. Again, it wears on people over time. This one here, goodism, as referred to by Dr. Sarno, I kind of throw in niceism there as well. That's where if you just are good all the time and nice all the time, you will be able to avoid conflict, and you won't feel those internal aversive emotions. And so it's kind of related, close to perfectionism, but slightly different. And the reason I like to put niceism in there, I think it's really important to differentiate being nice from being kind or compassionate. People who are nice may be doing it to avoid conflict, or they may be doing it more for an external control issue of trying to create an image for the world of who they want the world to see them as. But a lot of times it's really in avoiding any form of conflict. Whereas kindness involves setting appropriate boundaries for people. Kindness is the idea. John Wooden was great as a coach who said that discipline is an act of love. Accountability or setting boundaries for people is in fact being kind for them, so they're not weaving down the road, crashing into not only you but everybody else. But there can be that moment of a little bit of conflict when you have to set a boundary for somebody. So this kind of goodism, niceism strategy is not a good long-term plan. Again, you can use it in the short run to get out of a situation, but if it becomes a chronic repetitive pattern, it becomes problematic. And then we get to the Stoic. The Stoic who dives down into this sort of state of not even feeling emotions, that alexithymia kind of thing, where they're going to stuff everything. They can endure everything. Their self-image and the image they want for the world is one of being tough, of not being influenced by emotions, being steady, being hardworking. You know, you look at the greatest generation coming out of World War II, and that produced a lot of Stoics that we highly admired, but it can be problematic. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. I just want to point out one thing, that what happens a lot of times is when people pair up, you get one of these guys with one of these guys, right? These guys down here are not very good at setting their boundaries around them. They let people come in and they kind of just take it, right? And these guys are looking for people that they can control, and they naturally sort of partner up, but over time it gets wearing, and eventually these guys down here have to decide that they're going to set some boundaries around themselves, and that can cause these guys up here to get really upset. So those are always those challenging relationships to kind of negotiate through. I am gonna, because you know, the shtick on this whole thing is I have taken this on kind of with a coach's hat on, and so the Stoic is interesting in kind of the coaching world. I'm going to digress just a second here, but the University of Washington just lost one of its former coaches. He passed away, and he was a fabulous coach, and he spent 30 years devoting himself to the University of Washington. He was a player there, and then he was an assistant coach, and then the defensive coordinator in all of the glory years, and then he went on to become the head coach before he retired. His name was Jim Lambright, and Coach Lambright was he was so much fun because he was so real. He was gritty, he was tough, he was passionate about what he was doing. Sometimes his emotions were a little bit on his sleeve. I have to bring him up because when I started coaching, and I was a position coach and then a defensive coordinator, I really wanted to emulate him. Then as I went on and became a head coach, I started to realize I was going to try to emulate somebody else. And what I ended up doing was sort of becoming the stoic, unflappable, unemotional coach. So I went from this sort of authentic self to this super stoic kind of person as a head coach, and that was based on modeling and probably, you know, all these little predictive codes going on in my brain. But I found as a head coach, my longevity for a job was about 6 years, and then I was feeling tired and kind of burnt out. I was sort of holding my emotions in all the time, you know, not trying to be positive, never have a negative thought, repressing any aversive emotions. And I think we see this in the coaching community right now, and the University of Washington also not passing away, but to retirement, lost one of the best coaches in the country, Chris Peterson. And my sense, I don't know this, but my sense is that he was burnt out. And I think the common denominator for burnout in coaches, this going into kind of a depressed mode and not really feeling your emotions anymore, is this strategy of stoicism, of stuffing everything and holding everything at bay. So I'll go back in history, and Bill Purcell's described this multiple times in his career, where he got to a point where he didn't even enjoy winning. He couldn't feel the happiness of winning when he was burnt out. You know, another great coach in the United States is Nick Saban. And I read his book, and he talks about after winning his first national championship at LSU, that he sat down and he questioned himself why he couldn't feel happy. He wasn't joyful, he wasn't satisfied, he was just flat. And I suspect he's another one of these type of coaches. Urban Meyer has kind of gone up and down on the burnout scale and had a lot of different physical issues come up. And I suspect that is also probably due to taking a stoic strategy for an illusion of control in this world. So I'm just going to throw that out there because I think it's something that every coach and every athletic director needs to attend to, particularly in their coaches, is that they are at high risk for burnout from stoic illusion of control strategies. Okay, a big digression there. Let's move over here. So the other thing we do, kind of, that I put in the secondary psychological diagnoses, these guys over here being the primary kind of ones, is that people start participating in distraction and numbing strategies in order to sort of ignore or dissipate these aversive emotional feelings in our bodies. So this really comes under the category of sort of addictionism. So the fight or flighty kind of strategies are stay in perpetual motion, keep exercising, overwork, do whatever you can just not to have to deal with your emotions. And then some other folks may go into sort of the consumption strategies of, of going for comfort food, and frequently under stress, as we talked about before. Our bodies really want simple foods, simple carbohydrates, sugars, because when we're running from the tiger, we're not investing any energy in our digestive system. So to throw a bunch of fiber and fat and protein in there is not going to work. It's just not going to digest well. It's not going to make us feel good. So we have this natural craving for simple carbs, which if you're not actually running from the tiger can be problematic as you start storing all that sugar into fat. But food definitely is a strategy for self-soothing. The other thing that we can get into is, I just put material up here, but is shopping, is, not feeling great, not feeling good about the world or ourselves or whatever, need kind of a dopamine hit, and buying something bright and shiny gives us a little boost, and that can sometimes lead to further problems down the road when you can't pay your Visa bill type thing, and so that's not a great strategy either. And then the next one is substances. So that's so common, and that under threat and stress, people are going to reach for different substances that might help to soothe them and make them feel better. So the one that always pops up first is alcohol. Alcohol works on multiple circuits, but it can sit on what we call sort of GABA or relaxation receptors in our brain, and get us to quiet down a little bit. It can be a little disinhibiting too. So under threat and stress, that disinhibition of some of the frontal cortical restraint that we have, then people can become actually more impulsive and sometimes more rageful, and it can cause other problems beyond just the addiction itself. Cocaine, amphetamines jack up our dopamine system. So our dopamine system makes us feel pretty good, feel pretty confident, feel pretty open if we're not under threat. But if we're under threat, they can also make us a little more aggressive. It can also make us a little bit more aggressive and confrontational. It's a very activating, feel-good strategy. And then we can get into stuff like ecstasy, which perhaps is more activating the serotonin system. It's a little bit more of a kind of chill and connect and bond, and it may cause a flush of oxytocin, which also is kind of a connecting hormone, helps us to bond. Cannabis, we have our own cannabis receptors in our brain. So we have endocannabinoid receptors. We make cannabinoids in our body. The cannabis goes and sits on those endocannabinoid receptors and kind of chills out the whole system, gets us to relax. We have quite a few endocannabinoid receptors in our amygdala, And maybe that is a primary target of why people can feel pretty good on cannabis. Now, it has THC in it, which has a kind of a weird effect, that it's a dissociative effect, can make people feel a little paranoid, and even in higher doses hallucinate. So it's a whole plant, and it's got a lot of different psychoactive substances in it, but certainly it sits on those endocannabinoid receptors and can cause a relaxation response. So I want to mention opioids in this substance because we're coming out of an opioid crisis very slowly. And my take on opioids is that they are not necessarily a feel-good, traditional substance of abuse that we hear about sort of in the literature of the reward and pleasure system. Now, our reward and pleasure system is governed primarily by dopamine. But I'm going to make the argument that although when we take opioids and they sit on our endogenous opioid receptors, so we make our own opioids, so we have receptors for opioids. So when we take opioids, they do alleviate pain, and they can have a mild euphoric effect. They can also be a little dissociative, and in higher doses people can get goofy and have nightmares or even hallucinate on them. But opioids, for me, belong in the threat-stress system. They are a stress hormone. So opioids are designed when we're in the 18th mile of running a marathon to help sort of soothe us, to modulate the pain and allow us to carry on. Similarly, if we're being attacked by a tiger, they can do the same thing. They can allow us to be able to tolerate more pain and injury and carry on. But if we look at what happens to us in the threat-stress response, and we've been talking about this quite a bit, is that under threat and stress, we become, let's go back, we stop secreting sex hormones and anabolic hormones. We stop secreting oxytocin, an endogenous analgesic and a hormone that helps us bond and connect, sort of the love hormone, right? Other things that we do under stress is we shut off our gut. We don't have a good appetite, our bowels are slow, we get constipated, and under threat and stress, chronic threat and stress, our immune function can deteriorate. So with opioids, they do all of those same things. Opioids shut down oxytocin secretion. They particularly shut off testosterone secretion in men, but they shut off sex hormones and anabolic hormones, and they shut down our gut. When you take them, you don't have an appetite, you may even have nausea, and they make us constipated. So they directly align with these other sort of threat-stress chemicals, and I think we need to regard them in that fashion. Now, weirdly, over time, opioids also help to ingrain pathways, pain pathways in particular. They cause sensitization to pain, and they can jack up the receptors that glutamate sits on, and cause more irritability to the central nervous system than sort of a relaxation effect. I just want to get that out there, that opioids are part of the threat-stress response, and if you are trying to treat threat and stress and chronic pain with opioids, you are perpetuating the problem, and you're going to get worse, and you're going to get sicker. Now, I'm not going to go back necessarily and say all of those other substances were great, but they would certainly be a better choice than using chronic opioids. You know, just for an example, cannabis does a lot of the opposite effects, right? It chills us out, it stimulates our appetite, we get the munchies, we can connect better with people, we're less irritable over time, whereas the opioid folks are, you know, they're cranky, skinny, no appetite, and constipated. They're not happy campers. So opioids are particularly toxic, and they are not an answer for chronic pain. Now, if you break your leg or the tiger bites you, you know, for 3-5 days, they're awesome. And then they start to kind of destroy you from a neurologic standpoint, an immunologic standpoint, an endocrinologic standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, and also from a social standpoint. You know, opioid addicts are very withdrawn and self-centered. So enough of that. And then we do some other weird stuff too, as sort of the distraction strategy. Get over focused on sex, start gambling, that gives us a little extra dopamine, and thrill seeking, you know, start skydiving and that type of thing. And weirdly, in people who are very depressed and in freeze and faint physiology and have some sense of dissociation and describe themselves as physically feeling numb, but also emotionally feeling numb, they will use cutting to sort of stimulate their system, to awaken it, to bring them back to being grounded. But it's a really awful thing to see somebody who's in that state and needs that to just somehow reconnect with their body and the world. So the thing that I want to point out here with these primary psychological diagnoses, and over here with these secondary psychological diagnoses and these illusion of control strategies and personality types that can disintegrate into disorders, and these distraction and numbing strategies, that every one of those sort of mental health issues or psychiatric diagnoses has a root of a chronic threat stress response. So the way I like to look at this is the root is the chronic threat stress response. It starts to come up as a trunk, and that trunk is essentially the primary psychiatric diagnoses, the symptoms that we see that are specifically related to fight, flight, freeze, or faint. And then the branches start coming off, sprouting out, and those are more these illusion of control strategies. What the things that we do to try to soothe ourselves and to hold the emotional uncomfortableness at bay. So those are sort of those little branches coming out, and then eventually we get into a lot of this kind of stuff here with the buds and the leaves coming off. But it's a continuum, and when we start trying to, you know, just intervene here or just intervene here, oh, that's a really hard one, just intervene here, or just intervene here or here, without sort of looking at this global load, the total load of threat stress, our success rate of treating people is not that good. So from my perspective, I like to reiterate to people and to patients that there's really just one diagnosis. You know, we've got the DSM-5, you know, that's not probably, you know, I'm sure it's bound in a book somewhere. I haven't seen it like that for a while. A pretty thick book of all of these different diagnoses, and there's just one diagnosis for this, and that's the diagnosis of being a human being in threat and stress. And with that, given that we're all human beings, any one of us who is put under enough threat and stress can end up with any of these diagnoses. None of us are immune to it unless we have great strategies for dissipating this which means managing all of this stuff. So it's the chronic threat stress response that really leads to all mental health issues. And, you know, I just think it's important to look at that. And then a few sessions ago, we talked about, you know, sort of these are the waves crashing on the shore and how they present. But to look at the ocean that fills up those waves that can lead to a chronic threat stress response and mental health issues, as well as physical health issues. So we had talked before about, you know, excessive demands and distractions, chronic analysis and cognitive overload, constantly comparing ourselves to the world and feeling inferior, and social media and other media and advertising and marketing all play into that. Threat and stress can come from a poor educational system that limits people's opportunities. People can get entrapped in dead-end jobs with bad working relationships. They can be victims of low wages. Certainly we're experiencing extreme income and wealth disparity in the country, and the people at the bottom end are in chronic threat stress. They're going to have more mental health issues as well as physical health issues. We suffer from a contagion in the United States, and that's this idea of being chronically busy and chronically working, sort of a workism that we were talking about that we've all adapted to. We have poor health care coverage for many people in the United States. We have even poorer mental health and addiction coverage, so it becomes harder to treat all these things. You know, we've talked about things like adverse childhood events. We've talked about things like the traumas of being a minority in society, and the spiritual injury of discrimination, and even the terrorism that's occurred for many communities because they are minorities. We've talked about, you know, a corrupt political system that isn't meeting our social and spiritual needs. In fact, it's making them worse. And now we've got a global pandemic. Prior to the global pandemic, we had concerns with global warming and the weather and environmental disasters that come with that. We've been in a state of chronic, whatever you want to call it, competition, conflict, but chronic war for 20 years, essentially. There are kids, particularly young adult males, who feel very disenfranchised right now. They see limited opportunity, and so where are they going to go to vent their anxiety, but more particularly their anger and rage? And they're going to gravitate to things like terrorist groups and gangs, and try to find a sense of control in the world through those avenues, and that doesn't work or help. You know, we have those same types of young adults committing a mass murder for similar reasons. They are disenfranchised from our society. They can be disenfranchised socially and financially and politically, and feel like they have no voice, and they're going to make a statement. We also have sort of all the foreign threats that we're always talking about with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Russia and North Korea and Iran and drug cartels and all that kind of stuff that kind of just keeps us a little bit anxious about what's going on in the world and how is it going to affect us. And as I've said before, we have this unique privilege, being human, of being able to contemplate our own annihilation, whether it be physical or spiritual, but we all die, and we all at some level carry that awareness of how feeble and fragile we actually are in this world, and particularly in the time of a COVID-19 pandemic, that even seems more real to many of us. So, you know, when we look at mental health issues, we can't just be looking at this neurotransmitter or that neurotransmitter or that neurotransmitter. We have to look at the total of what contributes to a chronic threat stress response in people. And so with that in mind, this argues towards a big public policy platform to help deal with this. And really, it needs to be not just in your community or in your city or in your state or in our country. It really, there's this saying, for any of us to be free, we all have to be free. And that kind of flows over into this concept. As long as the last man, woman, child on earth is suffering in chronic threat stress, at a certain level, all of us will suffer as well, because there are enormous costs. We can use the selfish gene in this equation. People who are not thriving end up being a burden to all of us, but we can also, you know, shift into this better part of our humanity, you know, our sense of justice and empathy and ethics and moral reasoning to address this problem in a better fashion. So I think what we should be focusing on in this world today is starting to create a pandemic of health and healing. And that is going to be something that's going to require not only addressing our physical health, but our emotional and social, spiritual health across the world. It's going to require cooperation and adaptation, and not conflict and competition. So we have some great organizations out there that are aggressively trying to fight viruses around the world, or hunger around the world, or clean water around the world, or improve the environment around the world and try to save the planet. And arguably, to do any of those things well, this should be our first focus, is trying to decrease the chronic threat stress load of the world, to allow people to heal, to come online in their best possible selves, to exhibit better behavior, more pro-social behavior, more connective behavior, more sort of collective consciousness type behavior, and then we got a shot. And we'll have a better immunity to fight things like the COVID-19 virus. Thank you.